Chapter 2, Brother, I'm Dying, by Edwidge Danticat. Something broke the first time my Uncle Joseph met his wife in May 1946. It was barely dawn, a gray morning over the blue-green hills of Beauséjour. The sun was slowly rising, burning through the fog that merged with the clouds over the highest mountains. My uncle, oval-faced, with a widow's peak hairline, mustached and pudgy, as he would remain for most of his life, was making his way down the winding trail that joined the village where he and his parents and 5 younger brothers and sisters lived, with the market town in the valley below. He had started from his parents' farm with a mule loaded with carrots and plantains and newly harvested pigeon peas that he planned to sell at the market. Running late, he tapped the mule's bottom now and then, encouraging it to hasten its steps. It wasn't doing much good. The mule was tired and seemed to want to stop and sniff each patch of dew-laden grass and muddy rock it encountered along the way. Uncle Joseph was growing exasperated when he spotted a young woman on the same path. With her high cheekbones and pouty lips, she looked like a calendar girl or a carnival queen. She was wearing a thin cotton dress which seemed glued to her body by the water still lingering from the early morning bath she had just taken in a nearby stream. On top of her head she wore a brown calabash sealed with a piece of dried corn husk. The calabash was resting on a piece of cloth wrung into a circle to serve as a base. Ignoring the mule, he stopped to watch her. She was one of the prettiest women he'd come across in his 23 years. How could he not have spotted her during all his trips to and from the market? Unsupervised, the mule wandered into a nearby garden and spilled some of my uncle's merchandise. The young lady was the one who first noticed the mule stomping through a row of young coca plants. Rushing forward, she motioned in its direction. As her body swayed back and forth, her arms waving wildly, she dropped her water-filled calabash, and it broke. My uncle offered to pay for the calabash. She insisted it was not necessary, but he talked her into taking a few pennies, a lot more than the calabash was worth. So began a conversation between Denise and me, my uncle later told me. Every time I went by afterwards on my way to market, I had to see her. We talked and talked for a few months, and then we took action. The action was to notify their families at the beginning of 1947 that they were moving to the capital together. The oldest of his sisters, my Aunt Ino, was already living in Belair, a hilltop neighborhood overlooking the Port-au-Prince harbor, and they decided to settle there. Though they did not marry, they bought a plot of land together and built a 3-room cement house topped by a corrugated metal roof. The house had a large front gallery that extended into the alley that curved toward the main road, Rue Tiramas. The entire house was painted salmon pink, both inside and out, except for the floors, which were covered with terracotta clay tiles. The hill in Belair on which the house was built had been the site of a famous battle between mulatto abolitionists and French colonists who controlled most of the island since 1697 and had imported black Africans to labor on coffee and sugar plantations as slaves. A century later, slaves and mulattoes joined together to drive the French out, and on January 1st, 1804, formed the Republic of Haiti. More than a century later, as World War I dawned and the French, British, and Germans, who controlled Haiti's international shipping, rallied their gunboats to protect their interests, President Woodrow Wilson, whose interests included, among others, the United Fruit Company and 40% of the stock of the Haitian National Bank, ordered an invasion. When the U.S. Marines landed in Haiti in July 1915 for what would become a 19-year occupation, Haitian guerrilla fighters called Cacos organized attacks against the U.S. forces from Belair. Belair also boasted one of Haiti's oldest and most beautiful cathedrals, as well as one of the island's best public schools for boys, the Lycée Pétion, which was named after Alexandre Pétion, one of the leaders in the Battle for Independence from the French, and a mentor to Venezuela's Simón Bolívar. When he first moved to Belair, my uncle got a job working as a salesman for a Syrian émigré in a fabric shop in downtown Port-au-Prince. There he befriended a fellow salesman, a Cuban émigré named Guillermo Hernandez, who quickly became his best friend. A few months later, my father, then 12 years old, left Beausejour and moved to the capital to attend school there. My aunts Z and Tina and Uncle Frank later joined them, along with my grandparents, Grandpa Nozial and Grandma Lorvana, who went to live with Tante Ino, the eldest daughter. Encouraged by my uncle, nearly everyone they knew was now living in Belair. He and Tante Denise kept adding to the house until it had 6 bedrooms, still pink. So when their son, Maxo, was born in 1948, there was room for him. And in 1952, there was also room when the Haitian wife of Guillermo Hernandez, his Cuban friend, died, leaving Guillermo with a 6-month-old baby to raise alone. It was Guillermo who asked my uncle and Tante Denise to take in his daughter, Marie Micheline, so he could travel back home to Cuba for a visit, a trip from which he never returned. Uncle Joseph's hero in the 1950s was a politician named Daniel Finois. Uncle Joseph liked to recount how, as a young legislator, Finois went to the public hospital in Port-au-Prince and finding poor patients lying on the floor while the rich patients were covered in beds, he forced the rich off the beds and gave them to the poor. Soon after my uncle moved to Belair, Finois started the Laborers and Peasants Party, Mouvement Ouvrier Paysans, which my uncle joined. For years, he and Tante Denise opened their house to Finois sympathizers for regular meetings, which were lively affairs with plenty of homemade liquor, clarin, and food prepared by Tante Denise, whom everyone in their circle agreed was one of the best cooks in Belair. When it came time to address the 50 or so people who'd gathered in this pink living room, kept sparsely furnished to fit the largest possible number of Finoisists, who often brought their own chairs with them, he would model Finois' forceful and direct Creole diction and speak in a clear, powerful bass, allowing only a few well-chosen pauses. "We have struggled since we became an independent nation in 1804, my uncle recalled saying. Certain people think that in order for the country to progress, only the rich minority might need succeed. This country cannot move forward without the majority, without us." Hardly earth-shattering, but he considered himself more of a disciple than a chief. All he had to do was echo one of Finois' favorite phrases to get applause. In his speeches to the group, my uncle sometimes evoked his father, Grandpa Nozial, who joined the guerrilla resistance against the U.S. invasion and who was often away from home fighting a battle he did his best to keep from reaching his young children. Grandpa Nozial would leave my uncle, the oldest, though still a child himself, the task of looking after his mother and siblings for weeks and months at a time. Each time his father left for a campaign, my uncle worried that, like thousands of Haitian guerrilla fighters who were killed by the Americans and whose corpses were dumped in roads and public parks to discourage others, his father might never come back. The men of my father's generation fought with all their might, my uncle would declare in a carefully modulated voice as he addressed the Finoisists who'd crowded into his living room, including his father, Grandpa Nozial, who, now widowed and looking older than his 65 years, sat stoop-shouldered, his once sinewy body beaten and worn, his head bouncing back and forth as he dozed off in the front row. But mostly, my uncle continued, these men used their hands and old-fashioned weapons. They used old crags, slingshots, machetes, and spears. They used whatever weapons they could muster up or create. Now we want to fight for progress. We want to fight with our minds. This is where real power lies. At the same time, the president of Haiti was Paul Magloire, an army general who unseated 2 of his predecessors, nicknamed Canson Fe, or Iron Pants, because of a speech he had given in which he declared that he must put on iron pants to deal with troublemakers. He had graced the February 22nd, 1954 cover of Time magazine, dressed in full golden military regalia, over a caption that read, Haiti's President Paul Magloire, his black magic, roads, dams, schools. In 1956, Magloire stepped down after a national strike over, among other things, increased dissatisfaction with his extravagant spending. In addition to roads, dams, and schools, it turned out, he spent lots of money on lavish parties, state visits, and costly reenactments of famous Haitian battles, mostly to amuse himself and a small circle of like-minded friends. Finois was one of many in a slippery line of succession who would eventually replace him. On May 25, 1957, as Finois was sworn into office, my uncle and father were part of a massive crowd that dashed to the National Palace to dance in celebration. However, after only 19 days, Finois was deposed by the army and forced into exile. François Papadoc Duvalier then assumed the presidency. Tante Denise woke up the next morning to find Uncle Joseph sobbing in their bed. My father, then 22 years old, has no recollection of his own reaction to all this, only of my uncle's, which was, quote, sad. After Finois' fall, my uncle had briefly contemplated running for political office, either as a deputy from Belair or as a mayor of Port-au-Prince. After Finois' ouster, he realized how precarious political power could be and abandoned all notions of being part of it. Feeling an ideological void, he joined a Baptist congregation that one of his friends belonged to, using the time he would have spent at demonstrations and meetings to go to church. The Baptists offered a promise of peaceful and stable life. They forbade so many things, including smoking and drinking, that there were few ways for a young man to get in trouble. The Baptists also forbade common law marriage. So after more than a decade together, when their son Maxo was 10 years old, he and Tante Denise finally married in a church ceremony, after which he became a deacon in the church. He then enrolled in a training course for future pastors, and while taking the course, befriended a group of American missionaries who regularly came to Haiti. He was eager to open his own church and a school. He was still wary of Americans from his memories of the U.S. occupation, but the missionaries were looking to fund a project in his area, and he didn't have enough to do it on his own. So he proposed his idea to them, and they gave him some money to help with the building, blackboards and benches, and pledged a monthly contribution for a free lunch program for the students. My uncle bought another plot of land in Belair and spent his evenings designing and then building his church. As the building came up from the ground, he would visit the site daily, both before and after his work at the textile shop. He'd stack bricks and mix cement, hammer wood with the workers. He wanted to feel like he was investing more than his heart and mind, that he was investing his hands and feet, his labor too. Because he believed that the church had redeemed him, saved him from a series of potentially hazardous choices, he named it L'Église Chrétienne de la Rédemption, the Christian Church of Redemption. The shotgun-style gable-roofed building, which doubled as a classroom and cafeteria during the week, he hoped would redeem others as well. As a child living in his house from the time I was 4 until I was 12 years old, I remember my uncle's voice being crisp and distinct, deep and resolute, breathy and jingly, and when he was angry, steely and muted when he was sad. When he began preaching sermons, my father recalled sermons which required that he project a wide range of emotions in 1 hour or less. My uncle had the same effect on the 100 or so people who attended his church as he'd had on those who crowded into his living room to listen to him about Finois. Many of them were indeed the same people, and were surprised now in the church how much passion he could stir in them. His preaching style was very straightforward, remembered my father. He talked a lot about love, God's love, the love we should have for one another. He knew all the verses for love. Sometimes I'd close my eyes and think, would I want to hear him if he wasn't my brother? And I'd have to say, yes. Yes, he would have made a very good politician, but my brother was a better preacher. But one day in November 1977, while preaching a lengthy sermon to commemorate the church's anniversary, my uncle's voice began to quiver, then squeak. He shrieked like an adolescent boy at one point, then could only moan the next. His throat and gums throbbed and hurt. The next day he went to the local dentist, who decided he needed to remove all of my uncle's teeth and replace them with dentures. His voice did not improve even after all his teeth were gone, so he went to see several other doctors. The doctors couldn't find anything wrong, so he went to herbalists, just as his parents and grandparents had before him. He was after all a child of the countryside, nous sommes mon, and had been treated by roots and leaves most of his life. But the herbalists, too, were stumped. Meanwhile, his voice grew fainter and his throat continued to ache. One afternoon in the spring of 1978, he was listening to the radio when he heard about a hospital in the south of Haiti that was associated with a radio station, Radio Lumiere. Some American doctors were coming to the hospital, and everyone who wanted to was welcome to come for a consultation. My uncle headed out to meet them. After a day of slow, difficult travel on pitted, rocky roads, the camion he was on broke down in the early evening. Near the town of Gros Marin, he walked into a small two-room house by the side of the road and asked a peasant woman if he could spend the night on her beaten earth floor. Her quick yes, so typical of the men and women of the Haitian countryside, reminded him of his childhood. Lying in her front room on a palm frond mat and one of her best sheets, he thought back to a childhood of working in the fields and the palm-covered classrooms with neither walls nor doors, where he learned his lessons sitting on the floor. He thought of a thin yet strapping father whose arms were so taut from a life of farming and fighting that he could render you unconscious with one slap while not even looking in your direction. He thought of the khaki-eyed American Marines who he was told ambushed guerrilla resistors like his father in the middle of the night while wearing blackface. The Americans had reinstated forced labor to build bridges and roads and had snatched the able-bodied men like his father and boys like himself from their homes. They were lucky to have been spared. So determined was he that he would not be taken that whenever Grampy Nozial was away from home, he'd sleep with a well-sharpened machete under his pillow. The next morning my uncle was startled out of sleep by the sound of a sisal broom sweeping in the woman's cactus-fenced yard. That gentle sound and the fragrant smell of brewed coffee helped remove his dread, filled him with hope. The woman handed him an enameled basin filled with cold water to wash his face and a handful of mint to brush the dentures she mistook for his own teeth. She then gave him a square of dimpled bread, which looked as though it was made from dough that had been poked with a dozen ice picks. The bread was carefully wrapped in a piece of muslin and lay on a plate that covered a metal cup filled with dark, sweet coffee. His hunger stirred. He gobbled the bread, washed it down with coffee. He thanked the woman for her kindness and hospitality, and with the air still cool from the night and the sun still low in the sky, he continued on his way. He had a long wait in the hospital yard. Hundreds of people were milling about, crouched in shaded corners of the concrete building, squatting under the giant almond trees, waiting. He was with men and women who were suffering from tuberculosis, malaria, typhoid fever, and other not so easily recognizable afflictions. It had taken him a good part of the morning to walk from the woman's house in Gros Marin to the hospital in Bonfim. He waited in the hot sun with the others until mid-afternoon, sweaty, hungry, and thirsty now, hoping he wouldn't be turned back. At last he was looked over by a nurse and placed among the least urgent cases. When it was his turn to see a doctor, one of the visiting physicians, a tall white man, pressed his tongue down with a thin wooden stick and told him he saw a mass sitting on top of his larynx. The mass might be a tumor, the doctor explained through a translator, and if not removed, could eventually block his airway and suffocate him. He wanted to do a biopsy right away, the doctor said. "Can you take it out?" my uncle asked. "We will only do the biopsy now," explained the translator. "We're taking a piece, not the whole thing, but when the entire mass is removed, you might lose your voice." Stunned, my uncle asked again, just to be sure, "Will I lose my voice today?" "We'll only do a biopsy today," the doctor repeated. Before my uncle could ask what a biopsy was, the translator, a Haitian doctor, added, "You have to let them cut a piece of the mass in your throat to examine it for cancer. It might be your only chance." During the biopsy, for which my uncle was given no more anesthesia than he might have gotten at the dentist office while having a tooth removed, he opened his mouth so wide that his face and neck throbbed. Lying there as the doctor clipped a piece of flesh from the back of his throat, He wished he could go back home and have one final conversation with his wife. He also wanted to preach one last sermon to his congregation, speak on the phone with his son, and to my father in New York. That evening after the biopsy, my uncle lay in a hospital bed unable to speak. Would his voice ever come back? He wrote that question on little pieces of paper the nurses gave him. They told him once more that this time it would, but probably not when he had the actual operation. The next morning the doctor explained through another translator that the tumor was cancerous. He needed a radical laryngectomy. His voice box would eventually have to be removed. Yes, he would most certainly lose his voice. After the doctors left his bedside, my uncle became aware that someone in the hospital bed next to his had a small transistor radio, which was tuned to the same station where he'd first heard about the American doctors. The station had a charter studio on the hospital premises, and the sound was coming through loud and clear. Over the airwaves he heard the lists of announcements about missing people and lost objects, a voice saying, "Reverend Joseph Nocius, please come home. Your family is worried about you." My uncle was staring at the ceiling and wondering whether the doctors with their biopsy had done him more harm than good when he heard the announcer's voice. It reminded him how important voices were. If you had one, you could use it to reach out to your loved ones, no matter how far away. Technological advances could help: the telephone, the radio, the microphones, megaphones, and amplifiers. But if you had no voice at all, he thought, you were simply left out of the constant hum of the world, the echo of conversations, the shouts and whispers of everyday life. As he lay there listening to the other patients talk to the doctors and nurses, to their family members, and to each other, it occurred to him that after the operation, he would never again be able to preach a sermon, or scream for help, or laugh out loud at a funny joke. He also knew he had to get word to Tante Denise that he was alive. Slowly he sat up and wrote a brief message on a piece of paper by his bedside and gave it to one of the nurses to take to the station studio for him. The message simply asked if they could let his wife know that he was all right at the hospital and would be home soon. When the doctors came back to see him that afternoon, they told him that they couldn't operate and remove the tumor. It was too large, and they didn't have the right equipment for the procedure. They asked if he had any family or friends abroad. He said that both his son and his brother, my father, were living in New York. The doctor gave him a copy of his medical file and wrote a letter for him to take to the American consulate requesting a visa to travel for the surgery. When my uncle returned home to Belair and, in a hoarser voice than he'd left with, tried to explain his diagnosis to his wife, his congregation, and even on the telephone to my father and Maxo, with whom he was planning to stay in New York, no one quite understood it. None of our relatives knew what a radical laryngectomy was. He didn't even know anyone who'd had cancer. As for permanently losing one's voice, the possibility seemed so remote that it almost appeared to be a curse, that, as some of the members of my uncle's congregation declared, only American doctors could cross an ocean to put on you. People were either born mute or not. They did not become mute, except temporarily if they were struck with a bad case of shock. Usually those cases could be easily cured with herbal remedies. Why not my uncle's? To put everyone at ease, my uncle said that maybe the doctors in New York would know more. Maybe he would discover other options, other solutions. Nevertheless, he gathered all his papers, land titles, everyone's birth certificates, made out a will, and turned everything over to the daughter of his friend, the 26-year-old Marie Micheline, whom he'd adopted and made his own. He wanted desperately to take Tante Denise to New York with him, but there were two problems. First, she was deathly afraid of flying. Then, because the likelihood of his returning to Haiti increased with his having a wife there to return to, her visa request was denied by the American consulate. Uncle Joseph and Tante Denise hadn't spent much time apart since he'd broken her calabash 32 years before. However, time was of the essence, so he had no choice but to travel without her, even though he feared that he might die and never see her again. In New York, Uncle Joseph had been at his son Maxo's apartment for barely 24 hours when he woke up in the middle of the night with a sharp, throbbing pain in his neck. Maxo was out with a friend. Uncle Joseph somehow managed to stumble out of bed and over to the only phone in the apartment, which was in the kitchen. He dialed my father's number. My father was living in East Flatbush, 3 subway stops, a 30-minute walk, and a 15-minute drive from Maxo's place in Ocean Avenue. My uncle heard a crackling as my father's phone was picked up. "Hello," my father said, his voice creaking anxiously. No good news could ever come at this hour of the night, he told himself. My uncle pressed his lips as close as he could do to the mouthpiece to whisper these 3 words. "Frère, ma, mourir." "Brother, I'm dying." "What's wrong?" my father asked. "Gauche," he replied. "Throat." My father told him to open the front door to the apartment and wait. Then he hung up and called an ambulance. When he called back, Uncle Joseph didn't answer, so my father got dressed, jumped into his car, and sped toward the apartment building where my uncle was staying. The paramedics made it before he did. When they arrived, they found Uncle Joseph lying on the floor near the front door, barely conscious, clutching his neck, gasping for breath. They tried to put a breathing tube down his throat, but the tumor was blocking his airway. So while racing towards Kings County Hospital, they performed a tracheotomy, drilling a hole in my uncle's neck to insert a tube there so he could breathe. My uncle had his radical laryngectomy the next day. When he came out, he was never able to use his own voice again. He was 55 years old. My uncle's operation cost around $30,000, which was negotiated down and paid for by his American missionary friends. As my uncle recovered at Maxo's house, my father advised him to remain in New York for a few months to make sure he was in remission, but he wouldn't listen. "What about my church?" he scribbled on a piece of paper. "My wife. Besides, this is not a good first visit to New York. Not enjoyable." So as soon as the doctors cleared him a month later, he packed his bags and returned to Haiti. Our lives were now even more solidly on different tracks, my father would later recall. He believed that his life had been spared for some reason, and only in Haiti could he discover why. He could have moved to New York when Maxo and I came, and he could have moved after that. But I don't think he ever really wanted to leave Belair for any place in or outside of Haiti. That's the end of chapter 2.